Whoa, 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 yeah, we are bringing the taste of yeah, 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 yeah,
yeah. Here's your host, Brandon Lauren Maxwell.
All right. My guest today is an associate professor of Latina and Latino history with a specialization in 20th century Mexican American history. She teaches a wide range of topics, including modern America, the Chicana and Chicano experience, women and gender, and the history of race and ethnicity in America. She is the author of the book From Coveralls to Zoot Suits: The Lives of Mexican American Women on the World War II Home Front. Please welcome to the show, Elizabeth Escobedo. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi, Brandon. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm happy to have you. I loved your book. By the way, for the audience, if you haven't read this book, go and check it out. I'll make sure that I include a link for you to be able to find the book. So I want to, before we get too deep into our subject, I want to set the stage for our listeners. So Pearl Harbor hasn't been bombed yet. The U.S. isn't at war yet. What does life look like for the typical Mexican-American woman in the 1930s?
Yeah. So I'll start out by saying this is very much a family history. My dad is Mexican-American, and his family came of age during the 1930s. And so the story for this book was really born with my two aunts, my tias, my Aunt Ida and my Auntie Ernie. And during the 1930s, as they were young women, the Escobedo family and like so many other Mexican families in the Los Angeles area and in Southern California, was going through a really difficult time, right? We were in the middle of the Great Depression, the biggest financial crisis that the United States had faced. And you had a number of people out of work. But this was particularly difficult for the Mexican community and especially Mexican-American women, because Mexican-American women at this time were often in jobs like food processing or the garment industries or in domestic work. And all of a sudden you had other individuals, Euro-Americans, white Americans, who were also suffering financially. And so you had job competition now for these sorts of jobs. And what this meant is that oftentimes Mexican-American women were pushed out of their jobs, employers instead giving these sorts of employment opportunities to quote unquote more deserving white women. Because of course, Mexican-Americans at this time were considered outsiders, foreigners, even for those like, again, my aunts and uncles, my father, who were born in the United States. They were deemed foreign by the very nature of their last name, of speaking Spanish, of growing up in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood. And so fortunately for my family, they did not get tied up in many of the deportation campaigns that were happening in Los Angeles during the 1930s. But of course, we know elsewhere in the Mexican community, you had a number of individuals, entire families or families divided, where you had Mexicans deported back to Mexico, sometimes not back, right? Sometimes we're talking about individuals who had never been to Mexico, especially if they were born in the United States, or repatriated because they were seen as taking what wasn't theirs because they were racialized others in this landscape of economic distress. And so within families too, Mexican-American women, I think, especially in the women that I interviewed for my book, and I know this was certainly the case for my aunts, there was a lot of sexual policing of Mexican-American women's social lives. And what I mean by this is that for a lot of Mexican-American women, the reputation of the Mexican family was sort of on their shoulders. And so a Mexican American woman, especially if you were a teenager or, in your early 20s, you are not allowed necessarily to go out in public without having a chaperone with you. And so for my tias, this was their older brothers. And you can imagine, you're a teenage girl.
Sure.
You are looking to rebel a little. You're maybe starting to date, wear makeup, flashy clothes. And the last thing you want is an older brother on your arm as you're, going out into public
Especially
spaces.
with the way Mexican brothers can be. Because I know how Mexicans can be. Because I'm one of them. And I had two sisters. And I'm telling you, for better or worse, I was like a lot of guys, and my sisters didn't tell me that they were dating anyone until they were like 30, because they were so afraid of me and my friends and what we might do. Yeah.
I mean, it was very, very real, right? This notion that, well, my brother's not going to let me do that. But it wasn't just patriarchal. It was also, a lot of mothers, traditional Mexican mothers really didn't want to see their daughters, again, going out without some sort of chaperone on their arm, or, engaging in any sort of dating and the like, because it was seen so much that the reputation of the family was on the line. And if the women were not operating quote unquote respectably or properly, this was somehow reflecting poorly upon the entire family. And so, my aunts really felt stifled. A lot of times, they were the ones that were supposed to take care of all the housework, all the chores, all the cooking, all the cleaning. And those sorts of expectations weren't there for the boys in the Escobedo family. And so there was a lot of tension. And as I talked more and more with my aunts, and especially when I did interviews with them when they were on their own and no one else in the family was there, it became very clear just how circumscribed they felt their lives were.
Wow.
And that they were really supposed to be just like domestic in the home. And maybe you could get a job and help out with the family, but you were doing that as a member of the family, not sort of getting your own wages for your own independence and sense of self.
So at that time, not only did women not have access to a variety of jobs to choose from, or decent jobs to choose from, they were burdened with this expectation to keep the family name a certain way, and that family name was largely dictated by the patriarchy, I guess you could say. I don't use that word a lot, but that's certainly how it sounds. And my own experience is that that's probably how it is, unfortunately, in a lot of families still. And how much of that stems from tradition, do you think, and how much of that stems from just socioeconomics?
Mm-hmm. I think it's both. I think, again, certainly near the beginning of the 20th century, so many Mexican immigrants, and of course this is still the case today, but that were very entwined in the Catholic Church. And so, you had ideas about sexuality and women's roles within the church and outside the church there as well. You also had, for a lot of immigrant parents at that time, the evidence that I sort of picked up on when I looked at juvenile court records, for instance, from the 1940s, you had a lot of parents who had daughters who were not subscribing to these proper, quote unquote, gender roles. And they would go to the juvenile authorities and just say, like, look, my daughter's out of control. She's wearing makeup. She rolls her skirt up and shows her knees, and she's hanging out with these boys on the street corner. What should I do? And so much of that was fears that young Mexican-American women were going to act like their Anglo counterparts, right? For a lot of Mexican immigrant parents, it was this idea that, white American women were sort of loose, and they didn't have necessarily, especially the further they got from immigrant backgrounds, a chaperone on their arm. And so for a lot of Mexican families, that was very scandalous. And so I think it's both. I think it's fears that, these young women are going to become too Americanized, and they're going to lose any sense of sort of Mexican tradition if they are acting like these white girls on city streets. But there's a tension there because, on the other hand, I think so many Mexican families were very aware that by maintaining a sense of their Mexican tradition and culture, that they weren't necessarily going to fit in and integrate into American society, and that had some societal ramifications as well. So you're constantly seeing this tension happening within Mexican families.
Yeah, and it sounds like there's kind of a trifecta of forces against women as well, Mexican American women, because you just outlined, so you have the family that both is steeped in tradition and then saying, hold on to our Mexican values because we don't want you becoming too Americanized because this is our perception of Americans. You have Americans who probably don't want to incorporate them or include them in the American way of life because they're viewed as outsiders. And then you have the men, the brothers, the fathers, who are steeped in machismo probably, and probably don't care about some of the other things that like tradition as much as they care about feeling disrespected and wanting to assert control over their sisters. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
That is absolutely right. And so, think about all of those pressures that are coming down on the shoulders of Mexican American women. That's a lot to navigate. And you also have, the American populace, especially when you look at those Mexican American women that sort of toyed with Zoot Suit culture and were perceived as perhaps gang members by the press or by being too scantily clad and sexualized by the media in Los Angeles in the 1940s. You have a lot of fear that these girls are too Mexican and they're never going to assimilate because look at them, right? They're wearing these clothes that we don't understand. And what are those Zoot Suits anyway? And they're very controversial amongst the white Los Angelino populace. And so again, you constantly have Mexican American women having to navigate, what's it going to be like? How do I act at home? How do I act at work? How do I act when I'm on the arm of my brother? When I'm on the streetcar, how am I presenting myself? And what is that image? And what does that mean for how I will be treated by my family, my community, and by the larger Los Angelino populace? Okay,
so war breaks out. The United States starts drafting soldiers. Now, a lot of these brothers begin going off to war. They begin getting picked up by the draft. Some of them skip town. This has an inadvertent, side effect on the current social, dynamics of the Mexican-American family in a way that is, conducive to the freedom of Mexican-American women, even though it was never the intention, it was the result. How did the war, as it started to break out and the brothers went off to war, how did that affect Mexican-American women?
You are absolutely right that it just has this tremendous unintended consequence because on the one hand, you have a lot of Mexican-American women who, of course, are so scared for their brothers and their fathers, husbands, cousins, uncles, male members of their community, and are very aware of the gravity of war and the potential consequences of seeing someone ship out overseas. But on the other hand, for so many women that I interviewed for the book, this was sort of their moment to finally feel a sense of freedom and a sense of self without a chaperone on their arm, without a father or brother or, telling them what to do. And my aunts in particular just felt a tremendous amount of freedom that was new and exciting. And of course, this is only, expanded when you think about the increased job opportunities that many Mexican American women are able to obtain in light of labor shortages, given that so many Mexican American men are now overseas. And so what we see on a broad scale during World War II is that a lot of defense industries, so in the shipyards, in the aircraft industry, there are tremendous labor shortages. And so many of these big companies recognize that if we are actually going to meet labor demands, we need to start hiring people of color. And we need to hire women of color. And again, when you look at these industries, it's a tremendous sea change. The aircraft industry had only hired white males since its inception, right? And now you have companies like Lockheed and Douglas Aircraft that are putting up billboards in Mexican neighborhoods in Spanish saying, "This war is your war. We need you. Please come apply. We will hire you." And it comes to fruition. You have Mexican American women that are being employed in record numbers in well-paying jobs. I mean, that's the other key here, is that those jobs in the defense industry actually pay well. It's like a living wage, right? And so for Mexican American women that had previously only been able to obtain, as I said, domestic work, seamstress, food processing industries that were very low paid jobs in the past, this was a tremendous amount of earning potential.
Right.
And related to that, you have a lot of Mexican American women who are, of course, meeting their obligations to their family. So they are giving money to their parents, their siblings, they're helping out with the family till. But in doing so, they recognize, I actually have some say, perhaps, in what I can do with my leisure time, because this money means a lot to my family. And so you begin to have a lot of Mexican American women using their newfound wages to go out to, dance clubs, to buy that Zoot suit that prior would have been, completely unaffordable. What a lot of people don't know about
they're
Zoot
expensive.
Suits, they're actually really expensive.
Yeah.
You had to be working in order to buy one, unless you had an amazing seamstress in your family who would make one.
Yeah.
They were really expensive. And so you're not talking about individuals who are just lazy, good for nothings, the way the press really portrays a lot of young men and women who wore Zoot Suits. You had to be earning a good wage to make money to be ordered to buy those very, fit, tailor-made clothes.
Right.
And so Mexican American women do this. They buy makeup, flashy clothes that make them feel really good about themselves. And they're also going into areas of LA that previously had been quite segregated. Right? I mean, prior to the war, it wasn't often that you would have Mexican Americans leaving their barrio communities and going into, downtown spaces regularly.
Right.
But this happens more and more with World War II. You have a number of Mexican American women who date service personnel. Sometimes that were Mexican themselves, but sometimes not.
Let me stop you right there, really quick. So let me back up just to recap. So you have the war breaks out. The unintended side effect is that it opens up new jobs for Mexican American women that they previously didn't have. These are paying jobs that allow them to earn new skill sets. And as a result, they earn more money. They use that money to go out, explore town, because also their brothers aren't there to try to assert control over them. So they have all this freedom that they haven't had before, and they're out on the town. By the way, I have this picture of this is from your book. Do you remember this picture from your book?
I do.
And I believe her name is Celia. Can you tell our listeners about Celia?
Yeah, Celia Dominguez. So she is, I don't know too much about her. I actually found her photo looking at the Douglas Airview News, which was a newspaper put out by Douglas Aircraft and all of its various sub-assembly centers in LA.
She worked on bombers, right?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
And so you have these women who are working on, on planes. They are the Rosita the Riveter that never gets talked about, right?
Yeah,
We
that
always
is
think of
cool.
Rosie, who's white and blonde, and but we had so many Mexican American women entering into these defense industries and making friends, cross cultural friendships on the shop floor. And I found so exciting too is that just years prior, you had Mexican Americans, up to 1 million people either deported or repatriated back to Mexico because they were seen as foreigners. And yet here, a few years later, you have these major defense factories emblazoning these pictures across their pages of Mexican American women helping to support America's war effort.
Yeah, it's such a swing. And most people have never seen that photo. I'll put it back up again. I had never seen it. It's an amazing photo because you just don't see, you're not accustomed to seeing Mexican American women working on bombers. But it happened, and there was labor shortage, and I think that's pretty cool. So you had lots of women going out doing things like that. They weren't just seamstresses and doing that type of work. They were really in the thick of it, doing some really important work. So they leave their neighborhoods. They go out. You will pick up where you had stopped, which is they start to date sometimes servicemen, right? Mm-hmm. Which I'm sure would not have gone over well with some of their brothers, especially if you're out there dating some white servicemen. Am I right?
You are right. That is right. So, and again, this is a phenomenon that was just not the case with my aunt and uncle. So many of the women that I interviewed talked about the fact that they dated service personnel. And what's interesting is that for some women, this was still a way to kind of get around, respectability and chaperonage, because for a lot of Mexican American families, the idea was, well, if you're dating someone who's in the service, my boys are in the service, so they've got to be, good, wholesome young men, just like my sons, right? And so a father and mother might be much more amenable to a Mexican American daughter dating a service personnel. It's also seen as sort of this patriotic duty, right? This idea that we are supposed to support service personnel, and so sure, go and join in with the USO and dance with a serviceman, maybe give him his number, even though that wasn't really allowed, and have these types of interactions that, if that individual wasn't in a uniform, probably might not have been seen as acceptable.
Right.
But as you said, it's also the fact that the brothers are gone. And so no one is there necessarily telling them that, you can't do this. And so a lot of Mexican American women do date fellow Mexican American service personnel, but some do branch out and date Black men, date, white men. And sometimes families are okay with that, and other times it causes a lot of waves.
Yeah. How much of a role, I feel like this is one of those things that hasn't been written about a lot, but how much of a role do you think Mexican American women venturing out, dating white servicemen, played in creating tension between servicemen and Mexican American Pachucos, who obviously went to blows a lot leading up to the Zoot Suit riots?
Yeah, I write a bit about this in the book, and I do think it plays a role because prior to the Zoot Suit riots in June of 1943, you have a lot of tensions on city streets between service personnel and so-called Pachucos or Zoot Suiters, and there's a number of different things going on here, because on the one hand, we know that there's a naval armory that is built right smack in the middle of one of the oldest Mexican American neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And especially when you're talking about a time when LA is very segregated, many Mexican American young men thought about that neighborhood as their neighborhood, right? If we're not allowed to go out safely and thrive in other parts of LA, well, then, we are going to ensure that these are our streets. And so there are tensions, right, when service personnel are in those neighborhoods. But there's also a lot of documented harassment that white service personnel engaged in against Mexican American women, sort of seeing them as sexual objects, as loose, right, and as theirs. Like, by very nature of you being a woman of color, you are therefore more sexually available to me as a white man. And naturally, that really angered a lot of men in the Mexican American community, as it did many Mexican American women. And so you had that harassment, happening on city streets. But you also had a lot of Pachucos and, young men who started fights with service personnel as well. And of course, this is all played up in the press, right? And the police are over policing Mexican American neighborhoods as it is. And so they're constantly bringing in Mexican American youth, which then the press spins off of and says, well, by very nature of the fact that they're always, in trouble with the police, they're obviously inherently criminal. And so, these tensions are rampant in the weeks coming to the head of the actual Zoot Suit riots in 1943. But I do think that when you look at the Zoot Suit riots through the lens of the Mexican American female experience, it does look a little different. There's not a lot of documentation of Mexican American women in that 10 days when we know skirmishes were happening between male Zoot Suiters and service personnel. And certainly service personnel were actively rioting against Mexican Americans in the community. But the news coverage is consistent in demonstrating the ways in which Mexican American women were harassed and repeatedly overly sexualized, which I think really fanned the flames of racial violence that occurred.
Well, so before we had the Zoot Suit riots, right, you also had Sleepy Lagoon,
Yes.
and we had roundups of various Mexican American youth, and it wasn't just men that were rounded up. Women also were rounded up. In fact, I have a picture right here of some women who were rounded up after Sleepy Lagoon. And Sleepy Lagoon, for those that don't know, although I would assume that most of you know, was an event that happened where a fight broke out, and I think his name was Jose Diaz, was found dead, stabbed on the side of the road. The media ran with it and said this was the result of ongoing gang warfare between Mexican American Pachucos. They did mass roundups. It was along with the media hysterics that were happening that you're referring to. All of this had been going on for some time leading up to the Zoot Suit riots. But yeah, most people don't realize that women were also rounded up.
They were. And what is interesting is that, as I said before, I looked at juvenile court records of Mexican American women from about 1939 on through 1950. And the first time that you see the word Pachuca or Pachuca type used to describe a young Mexican American woman is directly after the Sleepy Lagoon murder. Right. And
now, were they already using that as a derogatory way to refer to men before that? And that was the first time they used it to refer to women?
Yes.
Okay.
So it is clear that it is the Sleepy Lagoon, the murder of Jose Diaz, the roundup of Mexican American youth in the Sleepy Lagoon near the reservoir, and the so-called then Sleepy Lagoon trial. This is a really key moment that a lot of the Los Angeles populace is shocked that Mexican American women could actually be involved in this alleged gang activity. And And so you had a number of Mexican-American women that were pulled into police stations across Los Angeles alongside male counterparts. And the police then hone in on 8 young women who had been present at a party that night with some of the primary suspects in the murder of Jose Diaz, who the police were honing in on. And some are arrested, but quickly the way in which the narrative goes with these so-called Sleepy Lagoon girls is that, they just got pulled into bad company with these male Zoot Suiters, and what we're going to do to reform them is ship them off to the Ventura School for Girls, which at the time was a very notorious reformatory. It was notorious for the fact that it mistreated so many of the young women that were housed within its walls. And it had a very bad reputation for the ways in which young women were treated in terms of labor and also punishment, corporal punishment. And so that was a pretty significant sentence. And so what I try to bring out in the book is that as much of a tragedy as the Sleepy Lagoon trial was for the young men that were prosecuted and eventually imprisoned until the appeal of the case a couple of years later, it was really devastating for these young women as well, because many of these young women were young teenagers. And when you become a ward of the state and are sent to the Ventura School for Girls, you remain that way until you are 21 years of age.
Oh, wow.
And the appeals process, the Sleepy Lagoon appeal, really never took into account the young women that, just had their reputations dragged through the mud and then were experiencing a pretty awful experience within the Ventura School. And so that sense of justice that came later for many of the Mexican-American men really wasn't there for these young women.
That's really interesting. I'd never thought about that, but it's actually more than just the justice aspect. Although I was recently talking with somebody not too long ago who pointed out that the media didn't cover because the sentences were reversed or overturned, and those youth were released. But the media didn't cover that like they covered their arrests. However, and this is something that I've written about. When they came out, they were kind of viewed as heroes by other youth, because they had all these individuals were from 38th Street. They go in there, they come out, they get their cases overturned, they beat it, and a lot of people didn't think they did it to begin with, and it kind of solidified that underdog status that Pachucas were already, starting to gain. There's been people that have put forth the idea that that was a flashpoint in gang history as well, with the impact that had on the status of different neighborhoods. But women not only got the shaft by the media and the state, they never really came out and were recognized as heroes like the men. So they just completely didn't get anything out of it.
That's absolutely right. And if you think about it, there's another aspect to that story in that for many of these women, again, thinking back to all of the ways in which we've talked about how Mexican-American womanhood was defined, their reputations were really dragged through the mud in a way that was sort of irrecoverable because they never had that hero status. And I know there's been several scholars who have tried over the years to interview some of these women and to talk with them about their experiences. But many had not even shared with their families what they had gone through because it was so painful and considered so disreputable for a young woman to be pulled into the juvenile justice system, especially in connection with a murder trial. And so many scholars just sort of have backed off from that conversation because it's so painful.
Why do you think that that men and women approach the prison system so differently in terms of their sociality? Men, they go in. I'm not saying people like going in, but when they do, they often come out with it as a badge of honor. They click up with other guys when they're locked up. It's doing time. Society kind of puts them on a pedestal. And, women don't have that same type of mindset going in. Mm-hmm. And I feel like, for those that wanted to be rebellious, it solidified their rebellion. And there were people who were rebellious. And I'm just curious as to, is that a social thing? Is it just a difference in how, maybe the women approach things as opposed to the men when it came to the fashion and stuff? And it was only fashion, and then they got locked up and it ruined their lives. But for the guys, they seem to adopt a bigger custom, and I'm just trying to figure out what the difference is there.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to put words in anyone's mouth. I'm not sure, but I wonder too how much of it is just about the double standard, right? This idea that women are just viewed and treated differently. And so therefore the social ramifications of coming out of that sort of situation, again, when we're talking about a traditional Mexican family and women are supposed to remain chaste and in the home, that's a far cry from being imprisoned. Right. And so what sort of ramifications might you have in your family, being shunned by your community? And of course, the Zoot Suit phenomenon was so controversial in Mexican families. You had, for instance, the Spanish language newspaper La Opinión in the early 1940s calling Mexican American women who wore Zoot Suits Malinches, which is really sort of the ultimate just demeaning characteristic, right? This idea that you're a traitor to your community. And so I think many Mexican families really worried not only what this said about their daughter's sexuality, right? Are they being promiscuous? And what are the implications of that for us? But also, what does this mean for us ever being able to be treated as insiders in this larger American landscape?
Were there any women that celebrated trying to be rebellious, that were more transparent about it than others?
Yes, absolutely. So I talked to a number of Mexican American women who absolutely loved the feeling of putting on a zoot suit and getting their makeup just right, teasing their pompadours as high as they could. They felt beautiful. They felt like they stood out. And they felt like they were really flaunting this very public presence. And I think for a lot of them, too, it was a way of saying, no, I don't really want to fit in as a quote unquote white American. Rather, I want to be recognized for being different. I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of being Mexican American. And this was their way of demonstrating that in a very public space. My aunt Ida, she actually was given money for her high school graduation to go buy a dress. And of course, my grandma assumed that this would be sort of this nice, flowery, beautiful, respectable piece of clothing. And my aunt decided to instead buy a zoot suit. And so she showed up on stage without anyone in her family knowing what she was going to do in a zoot suit. And her mom was so mad. She was really angry with her daughter. But for that moment, when my aunt was on that stage, she reveled in the fact that she looked fine. She looked really good and felt really good about who she was. And that's really important, especially when you are growing up in a community where you are treated like a second-class individual.
Yeah.
By very nature of the color of your skin or an accent or where you live, by very nature of being Mexican American. And so this was a way for her to say, you know, I'm proud to be different.
Yeah, it sounds empowering. And that's how it was, I know, for a lot of the guys as well. I try to, you know, it's an iconic fashion. It's an iconic look that still, you know, a lot of aspects of it have withstood the test of time. Just like with the guys. I mean, I talk and write about this a lot, is that transition from that kind of Pachuca look to the Cholo look. But there's a lot of carryover in still how people presented themselves, how they stood, you know, the creases and stuff. That's just stuff never went away. And I've always thought, I have no way to prove this, but I've always thought that with the 38 Streeters coming out of jail in such a public incident and bringing the jail look and mixing it with the Pachuca look back out on the streets, that laid the groundwork for the future kind of Cholo fashion of mixing those things. Just a theory. I can't prove it, but
I love that idea. That's brilliant.
Well, I mean, it had to have happened somewhere, you know. And I always hear these theories by people that they don't make sense. You know, they come up with these theories that are steeped in, you know, urban legends and things like that. But when I think practically about how it could have happened, that's what I always go back to. So that's just, you know, I don't know. I think it's interesting though. And I try to think, you know, in comparisons to the 90s when the Cholo look was really big, probably the equivalent of coming home with a shaved head and a creased shirt and creased dickies was equally shocking to the families. And for the women too in the 90s, right? The cholas that would come home with their hair up and the big rings, and I'm sure their families were also mortified just like they were in the 40s.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, that's what happens too when you have, you know, we have continuous immigration, right? So you have more traditional Mexican values coming across that border, but you have children that are growing up here and, you know, defining American as they see fit.
Well, yeah, and Mexican American culture is very unique because of the relationship that Mexico has with the U.S. It's unlike any other country. I mean, for one, you have the southwestern part of the U.S. that at one point was Mexico. And two, because it's connected to Mexico, you have an endless stream where you're constantly connected to aspects of your culture. Whereas, you look at Italy and things like that, when the immigration wave stops, that connection dies off over the generations. You saw it with the Irish, you saw it with Italians, but it doesn't happen with Mexico. There's always that second generation who's kind of always adopting something interesting in Mexican American culture. It's why Mexican American culture is so vibrant.
Yes.
Yeah, I can go off on tangents about this forever, but it's something that I love. I mean, that's why I'm so fascinated by it. I mean, I grew up with it, and that's me, and I think about it a lot. But it's, women and men have both played this kind of joint role, whether they realize it or not, in this fascinating subculture that has impacted the world. Okay, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's one of the reasons, too, unfortunately, why so many Mexican Americans and members of the Mexican community are continuously considered outsiders and others and foreigners, because we do have these continuous waves. Unfortunately, the American public, by and large, doesn't always see the good and the vibrant in that trend.
So after the war, then, when things start to settle down again, what was permanently changed and what went back to how it was before?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the sort of more negative consequences of the end of the war is the fact that so many women, by and large, not just Mexican American women, but as a whole, end up losing their jobs, right? So the idea is that we have returning servicemen, they have sacrificed, and it's time to step aside and make way back to your homes, your traditional female roles, so that men can take these jobs upon their return. And so you have large-scale layoffs of women across the board. But of course, because of racial hierarchies, it's women of color who are going to be the first fired. And so a lot of Mexican-American women end up losing those lucrative jobs that they had during World War II.
What was there a collective feeling about that? Of course, I'm sure they didn't like it, but were they outspoken about it at all? Now that they had tasted this freedom, they'd had those jobs, or was anybody just like, I'm not doing it, I'm not going back to how things were before?
Yes. So I actually looked at quite a few records from the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which was one of the first federal agencies that's put in place during World War II that allows for employees to actually put forward claims and complaints against racial discrimination on the job. And so you have a number of women who start writing into the FEPC saying, you know, this is unfair. We just got, all of the Mexican women got fired en masse, and they're keeping the Anglo women there.
Wow.
You know, this is very clear discrimination. Oftentimes those complaints fell on you know, deaf ears.
Did they not have labor unions for those federal government jobs?
There are some labor unions at the time, but again, so many of these unions still have the notion that those jobs belong to men.
Oh, wow. So it was even steeped in the unions.
Yes. And so the good news, I guess you could call it, is that the Cold War actually means another infusion of government contracts and monies into various corporations. And some Mexican-American women a few years later are able to actually go back and get defense jobs again because of this Cold War spending. And that was the case with both of my aunts. They were able, years later, after they had married and had a couple of, or each had a child respectively, were able to go and work in the defense industries again. The other thing that changes is that more and more office jobs end up opening up for Mexican-American women in ways that hadn't been there prior. So clerical work, that sort of thing. You have many Mexican-American women begin to make inroads in those sorts of jobs.
Well, what changed that created the need for office jobs? Were there just more businesses that... Just
more businesses, but also it's the idea that these same jobs, now we could actually perhaps hire a Mexican-American woman because she had proved herself in the defense industries, right? So there was, I argue in the book, for those women who were deemed quote unquote respectable and patriotic, right? They take on defense jobs. They serve as USO hostesses. There's a bit of a sea change in conversation about what Mexican-American women can accomplish. And so you do see that upward social mobility in terms of jobs. There were Mexican-American women and their families that were also able to purchase homes in suburban neighborhoods in ways that African-Americans could not. And I think what happens is that Mexican Americans are seen as sort of more of an in-between community, right? That if individuals are deemed respectable and proper, that they can actually have some semblance of social mobility in ways, again, that African Americans simply weren't allowed in that post-war era. Now, of course, Mexican-American women could also be very racialized, especially those that chose to adopt aspects of the Pachuca look and to wear a zoot suit. They were reviled and seen as racialized others, and would have a more difficult time. So it depended on sort of how you were presenting yourself and your reputation as to whether you could sort of cash in on post-war benefits. Right.
So basically, if you adopted America's version of what an American should look like or act like, then you might have a better chance and opportunity than someone who plays it down the middle.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, so the war comes to an end. Some women go on to experience some upward mobility. Some don't. What's funny is that for the ones that go back into working in those industries and utilizing the skills they'd picked up, it takes another war, a Cold War essentially, right, or some type of confrontation with another country, which is unfortunate.
That's absolutely right. Yes, that is absolutely right. Because you have so many women who decide after the war that they actually want to settle down and have children, right? We have to remember that you had the Great Depression and then you had this major world war. And so a lot of Americans, male, female, no matter your background, were looking for some semblance of stability. And this is, of course, why we have the baby boom, right? So many people decide that they're going to settle down and buy a home if they have GI benefits and have babies. And so a lot of Mexican-American women do this. But many also realize, number one, they liked working. They really loved it. And so this was the case again with other women of other backgrounds too. And so what we begin to see is that more and more women decide once their children are off in school that maybe they'll take on a part-time job, get a little pin money, right, for the family. Because of course in the post-war era, it's hard to live on one salary.
Yeah.
If you want that middle-class lifestyle, you sort of need both individuals in the household, both adults working.
Did that force a lot of the brothers who would come home from the war to just to accept the fact that maybe their sisters are going to have to go out and work? They didn't like it before, but now because the dynamics have changed in terms of expense and things like that?
I think so. I do. I think there's a sea change and a recognition that, number one, women in our community are different. They've been changed by this war too. And number two, the fact of the matter is we need two salaries, or multiple salaries coming into the household to maintain a modicum of a middle-class work lifestyle. And then, of course, as you said, you have this conflict that produces the need for more labor and, again, in good-paying jobs. And so you have Mexican-American women who are cashing in on the fact that they have these skills that they learned during World War II and that they can do this work. Doesn't mean they don't face discrimination on the job. It's a lot harder for a Mexican-American woman to get a job in a defense industry in the post-war era.
Sure.
And I know a lot of women faced harassment at their, places of employment from male employees. It was difficult. But for many, they wanted the money and they wanted that sense of independence that a job gave them. And they tasted that freedom during the war. It's
sad that it came with that caveat, though. And I guess to some extent it's something that, a lot of people still experience. Is there anything that you would talk about that I didn't bring up with listeners that you think is important?
I think I'd point out a couple of other long-lasting trends. And the one I really want to highlight is that we see intermarriage rates go up in the Mexican community after the war. Interestingly. Yeah. And so you see a lot of Mexican-American women marrying outside of their communities. And I think part of this, again, can be explained by the fact that they were simply coming to contact with so many different types of people in their wartime jobs or going out in public spaces, going to USO events, that it made sense that eventually you might settle down with someone who's not from your neighborhood, and so that's a significant implication. But I also think when I talk to so many of the women that had come of age during World War II, they raised their daughters differently. And I think many are more amenable to their daughters having certain freedoms and to working and to perhaps dating outside the community
than
they would have if they were a traditional Mexican mother or father. Right. And so that that looks very different. And so many of these daughters end up going to college, or they might be a part of the Chicana feminist movement themselves. And I think it's important to look at sort of this generational thread about what their mothers were experiencing and why they're where they're at and have the beliefs about women that they have.
That is so interesting, because you had the Chicano civil rights movement 20 years later, right after basically World War II. So those daughters being raised by those women who might have taken, ventured off and had some newfound freedom, it would make sense that they would also, pass on that belief, and then their daughters would take part in the Chicano civil rights movement, which also encompassed women, but also went up against some of the same problems, which is a whole separate conversation. But
it is
interestingly enough, the name of the book for our listeners and watchers is From Coveralls to Zoot Suits, The Lives of Mexican American Women on the World War II Home Front. It's a great book. Let me see if I can throw it up right here as well. I will make sure that there's a link for it where people can find it. I recommend it. It's a great book on the subject. I've seen a lot of books on the Zoot Suits in general, but there's not a lot of books that address women during that time, and this is one of the better ones. In fact, I think it's the best one. So, Elizabeth, I thank you for joining us and discussing this with us. And if people want to follow your work, is there a good way that they can follow you?
Absolutely. I, again, teach at the University of Denver. I'm an associate professor there. So please feel free to reach out. My email is elizabeth.escobedo@du.edu.
All right. Thank you. Thank you for everybody who listened and for who watched. And I hope you join me again next week. All right.